Hello and welcome to the Just Call Paula and Justin podcast. Justin Campbell and myself, Paula Mayer, are licensed real estate agents here in the Twin Cities. And today we have a special guest with us, Marguerite Cutchey, who is with Executive Title. And we are going to pick her brain on what title is in Minnesota, some good questions for seniors and taking over title, and about her practice and getting to know her as well. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I really am honored to be here and thrilled to be speaking with you today.
Yeah, we're excited to get some good information just to pass on to people who have questions about title, who don't understand. And so let's just jump in with some of the basics and just talk basically, what does title mean here in Minnesota?
So in Minnesota, property is either abstract or Torrance property. And I know that sometimes I get questions from sellers that have been in their home a long time on whether they need to provide the abstract or the Torrance certificate. We no longer need those for closing. All those records are down at the courthouse. So for Torrance property, for instance, there's a certificate of title down at the courthouse, kind of like a car title that shows you're the owner of the property. And we just pull that information online now, so it's much easier. And then with abstract property, there used to be a thick history of the property that was updated every time the title transferred all the way back to 1855. And those could be quite expensive to replace, $1,500 easily. Sometimes sellers still have those, but they're not needed for closing any longer because, again, we just pull the information online from the county.
Okay, and what is the difference between abstract and Torrance, and which is most common?
Super simplified. Abstract property, all property used to be abstract, but when there was a title issue that couldn't be fixed easily, it would go through court proceedings to transfer it into Torrance property, which just a new certificate's prepared every time title transfers. So it's basically a court proceeding to convert the property from abstract to Torrance, and generally was done when there was title issues that needed to be cleaned up. So.
Okay. Well, what are the different options in how one could take title on a new purchase?
So, depending on if you're getting a loan, the lender will dictate what they can and can't do. I know that usually you can't take title as an LLC if you're getting a loan. Some lenders don't allow trusts to take title. I know that for the senior community, the trust, owning title in trust is much more popular. And if you're needing to get a loan, it's usually you'll have to go through the whole loan process, buy the property in your name as an individual, and then you can convert it after you close to in trust. And it's super important to use a reputable attorney that, specializes in that type of real estate law.
Absolutely. And what types of insurance are available when one is purchasing?
So different states have different requirements on this too, but in Minnesota you have the option of purchasing owner's title insurance. I would say that 99.9% of the buyers do buy owner's title insurance. That protects the buyer against title defects. So again, property goes back to 1855. That's when the government first gave out land. So owner's title insurance will protect your ownership in the property all the way back to 1855. So if there was ever any undisclosed heirs, encroachment or boundary line questions, if there were mechanics that or contractors, subcontractors that perform work on the property, you're protected against mechanics liens. You're also covered the gap. So for instance, some of the counties, we can only see what's been recorded down at the courthouse up to about a month prior to closing. So if the seller took out a mortgage or something happened in that gap period, that we don't know about, owner's title insurance, with our company anyway, will protect the buyer against those types of liens or title defects.
Okay, and that seems like a pretty smart idea to invest in that if you're investing in a property, and then literally it is giving you insurance that you've got a clean
Protection
slate.
that you own that property.
Absolutely.
So if you're getting a loan, again, you're already having to purchase title insurance to protect the lender against title defects, and then you would just be adding on that piece of protecting yourself. So there are certain title situations that the lender may not be concerned with and doesn't affect them. So with the owner's title insurance protecting yourself, you're protecting your equity in the property and your ownership.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying. And who picks the title agent when they're selling or purchasing a home?
Sure.
How does that typically work?
In Minnesota, the buyer has the right to choose their title insurance company. So it is the buyer's choice. A lot of times the real estate agent or the loan officer will make recommendations because most people don't understand the title process and what that is. So a lot of times the buyers will go with recommendations from their trusted advisors.
Yes.
But it is the buyer's choice in Minnesota who they use, unless there's some specific language in the purchase agreement that a seller has added. So in the case of some new construction closings or relocation closings, specific types of transactions where a seller has their own purchase agreement that they use, there may be some language in there that requires the buyer close at their title company, but then the buyer would be signing off on that and agreeing to it in the purchase agreement.
Okay, that makes sense. So prior to closing on a property, let's say for the homeowner who is selling, what would you need from the homeowner to close that transaction?
Is that after a purchase agreement is signed, or
yes. So
before?
hypothetically, purchase agreement has been signed. You're moving forward. Everything's been cleared.
Okay. So when we get a transaction, it's right in the very beginning, right after purchase agreement signed. So we'll receive a copy of that, usually from the real estate agent or the loan officer, if it's a buyer. And then we'll send out a secure email immediately to the clients that ask questions. For instance, do you have mortgages on the property and judgments or tax liens? So very important questions that we ask right up front so that we know that if there's something that we need to be working on, or outside of a regular type of transaction, we jump on it right away. We also, in that first secure email, before we can go any further on the transaction, there's all kinds of information in there about wire fraud. So wire fraud is a real big risk in our industry, and so we want to warn people right away, right in the very beginning, not to trust emails asking for wires, because your agent, your loan officer, your title company will never do that.
Yes, and I was going to actually jump into that question, which is kind of piggybacking onto yours, but how can, I guess, is there anything that a homeowner would look for in your email to know that it's secure from you, or do you have any advice of what a homeowner could look for in an email to make sure that it's secure and you're sending all your information to the correct person?
Sometimes our realtor will, right in the very beginning, connect all of us through an email. So they put an email address to a party and they know that that's part of the transaction. I have also gotten emails after we send out that secure email from our realtor saying, hey, my buyer or my seller got this email, and then a screenshot, is this you? So, or, if the realtor gives the phone number for us to the client, they can always call and say, hey, I just got this, is this you? So I think, you can't be too safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so.
So, and before we kind of jump into our next segment about seniors, my final question about closing is, where does the title go? Do I leave with it? How does that work?
So that's a good question, because I also wanted to add, when you have a purchase agreement, and maybe even before you have a purchase agreement, super important not to pack or shred that vinyl closing pouch that you got when you purchased. Because the owner's policy that we were talking about earlier, I always tell buyers to put that owner's policy in their vinyl closing pouch. If there's a title problem that pops up, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be when you go to sell. Yep. And so if there's a title problem, something from the past that comes forward and creates a problem where you can't sell your property because something needs to be resolved from a prior transaction, you need to be able to give that owner's policy over to the next closing company so they can resolve it quickly and efficiently for you. Okay. It's super challenging when sellers have already cleared their whole home and shredded documents and packed things. So, and then I can't remember your question. I think there was one you just asked me that made me think of that.
Just after
the
closing
title.
the title.
How
Do I physically take that with me?
Good question. Okay, so the
work?
vinyl closing pouch is what you'll get at closing. It has copies of all the documents that you signed. It will have a copy of the warranty deed in it, and the warranty deed is what the seller signs that transfers title to the buyer. Okay. That is just a photocopy. The original goes to the county and gets recorded at the courthouse. Okay. Then with the owner's title insurance, that will come to you in probably 3 to 4 months. Once the documents are recorded, the owner's policy will come to you with a copy of the recorded deed. So that's what you get now. So instead of the Torrance certificate that we were talking about in the beginning, or the abstract of title, so that thick history of the property, really it's a copy of the deed you're getting, knowing that you received title, and then the owner's policy, which is your protection of ownership that you'll receive later.
Okay, fantastic. Well, so jumping into the topic of seniors and just kind of taking care of their housekeeping, do you have any advice? Let's say, for example, my mom, who's aging, still has, doesn't have any health issues now, but is almost 80, still is sound in mind, but say she had developed dementia, what are some things that she could do? Would it be advantageous for to transfer the title over to a relative? What do you recommend in those situations?
I can't give legal advice.
Sure.
But I can
advice.
say, through my own personal experience of dealing with elderly parents and friends that I know going through the same thing, it's much better to have the conversations prior to dementia or Alzheimer's. Absolutely. Because they're still able to be involved in the process of switching how title is held, and then that goes back to, it's really important to deal with an attorney that specializes in elderly law or estate planning. I can say for my mother, because of her situation, I connected her with an attorney that I know that I've dealt with over the years, but it was best for her to put both of her properties into trust, and then after they were in trust, to sell one on a contract for deed and then sell the other one on contract for deed, and for her to receive payments and interest, not have capital gains, because when one contract was paid off, there's another couple years later for the other. So I guess my point is it's much better to get that figured out, even though it's kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it's so much easier to do it when they're still able to make decisions for themselves and what their desires are and where they'd like to be. And
yep.
Yeah, and it just gets harder. It's scary to make changes, but if it's scary this year, it's going to be scarier next year. So it's just, it's hard to do it, but it's even harder later on. And then you run into problems later on where if you do have memory issues, you're not able to sign for yourself, so you have even less say in where you want to be and who you want to be with and how you want to do it.
Yep, so, absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of different, every situation is different, so an elder law attorney would be advantageous to help.
There's so many different ways of doing it to avoid more expense later on.
And so what happens in the case of, let's say my mother passed away tomorrow, has not done any of these things yet. Mm-hmm. What happens with title in that situation? I assume, does it go into probate? Mm-hmm.
Depending on how the title is held, if it's held as an individual, yes, it would go through probate.
Okay.
There can be, things like transfer on death deeds and like I talked about with trusts or joint tenancy with a child.
Okay.
So it depends. It all, sometimes I'll get purchase agreements where somebody is signing and they're saying they have power of attorney for someone that's not living any longer, which you can't have power of attorney, or
sure.
They're not sure if they're a trustee or they're a personal representative.
I see.
So if a seller isn't sure on how they hold title or a heir isn't sure on how their parents held title, we can do a search of the county records to determine who really has the authority to sign.
Okay.
And then what needs to be done. It's better to find that out before purchase agreement signed because some things can take months instead of, a month. So
sure, absolutely. And so speaking of time frames, with the market being as fast-paced as it is right now, a lot of closings are able to happen within 30 days. What is the minimum amount of time that you need on your end to get all of your paperwork and get everything ready to go?
From a closing standpoint, it all depends on how complicated the seller side is, really. So I do get that question. Usually it's, hey, I have a cash buyer, how soon can you close? And really it's like, if I could close in a week or 2 weeks, but it's really, the title work has to be done. That can be done in a short amount of time, but then what shows up on the title work? Are we needing to order payoffs? Is there a tax lien? Is there,
sure.
some kind of complicated, something that needs to be worked through on the seller side? So it all depends on the seller side in the case of a cash buyer.
Okay. Are there any tidbits or pieces of information that you would like to share off the top of your head that you think is important for seniors to know regarding title?
I just have to go back to make sure you keep that owner's policy. If you have an owner's policy, you paid for it, that's important to have it. Sometimes people find them in their safe deposit box, but just important to have it in case there is a problem, because that can be costly and time consuming if it's not available and there's a problem.
Okay.
If you can ask her about the mortgage burning party and it, like getting that registered, if you have paid off your mortgage and this binder sound like two very critical things that seniors might need to consider.
Are you talking about satisfactions of mortgage when you say mortgage burning? That is another thing that pops up, is just, especially when somebody...
What is a mortgage burning party? And I'll use that to segue in.
Okay. So on my way to meet you today, Justin and I were just talking about questions, and he mentioned a mortgage burning party, which I had not heard of, but what can you tell me about that?
So they're not as common anymore, but it's bringing up memories, right? Because I think people move more often than they used to, but I do remember, people that have lived in their home a long time, 20 years, because mortgages could be a 20-year mortgage back then, and then paying that final payment, and then getting the note, the paid in full note, and that being sent to them along with a copy of their mortgage and possibly a satisfaction of mortgage.
And people were actually physically burning these
them.
documents?
Yeah, so hopefully not the satisfaction. I guess I'm fine if you burn the note or the mortgage, but a lot of times when the homeowner paid off their mortgage on their own without using a title company or refinancing, the homeowner would receive the satisfaction of mortgage. And the only way to remove that mortgage off your title is to record it. So a lot of times it would have a cover letter that says, take this to the county and record it. And of course, the average person doesn't understand what that entails, but we will find old mortgages on properties, and they do need to be satisfied and released. And when you've got a lender that's no longer in business, it becomes very challenging. So yeah, so again, don't shred or burn or destroy your real estate documents until after you sell the property and close on it.
And close.
So if you have the satisfaction now, is there something they can do to get that, to make sure it's cleared and be done with it?
If you have the satisfaction now, keep it and give it to the closer, because I have had people go and record them because they had them before the closing, and then the county, like I mentioned earlier, may be a month or two behind in their recorded documents. So if that document they sent to be recorded isn't showing up by closing, then it means holding 1.5 times that original mortgage amount until it shows up, or postponing the closing. So 150% of unpaid mortgages is what gets escrowed.
Okay.
So don't do it.
Don't do it. All right. Well, and so,
So we're just going to take one quick.
all right. Well, before we wrap up, I did want to ask you about home equity loans and how that can affect title and closing.
Okay. And it does go back to the initial email that we send out asking for outstanding liens on the property. So it does ask in their mortgages and home equity loans, because sometimes people don't realize that when they bought that car a couple years ago that they actually took out a home equity loan, which is a lien that gets filed on their home. It's not a loan for the car. It's actually physically filed on the property. So that's why we do need to request payoffs for those. Or they've had a home equity loan that was always at a zero balance. They didn't need to use it. But it's still a physical mortgage filed on their property. And so we still need to contact that company to get a paid in full letter and request a satisfaction of mortgage. And sometimes we have sellers that will go ahead and pay off their home equity loan in the process of selling their home. And then that becomes problematic because the loan's paid off. The mortgage company hasn't filed a release of that mortgage on the property yet, but they're also not able to provide anything to the title company because there's no longer a loan. And that's another example of where we end up possibly having to escrow money, hold money in escrow until we can see that mortgage is satisfied from the records. So it's always better to leave those items for the closing table, paying off that home equity loan so that the closers can make sure that the proper documents are filed after they're paid off.
Okay, great. Well, so just going a little bit backwards and talking about you now, that you've answered all of these questions. I believe you started with Edina Realty Mortgage.
It was Old Republic Title, which was called Minnesota Title back in, I'm going to date myself, 1983.
Okay,
So
you've been doing
I like the industry,
almost
and I've been
30
doing
years.
it my whole life. So, and have worked at a couple different companies over the years and gotten a lot of valuable training with each company that I worked at.
And how long have you been with Executive Title?
I think I started in 2017. 2017.
All right.
I plan on staying.
Okay. Well, and what do you love about executive title?
I love the environment. I love the support. Just really good people. I like that it's independent of any real estate companies or mortgage companies. So I work with a broad spectrum of agents and loan officers and attorneys and financial advisors. So, yeah.
All right. Well, fantastic. And just for fun, on this cold Minnesota day, if you were to go on a trip tomorrow, where would you go?
Wow. I'll pick New Zealand. Today I'll pick New Zealand. Tomorrow.
Okay.
If you ask me next week, it might be someplace completely different.
That sounds pretty fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. And if you are listening and you're a real estate agent, we give kudos out to Marguerite Cutchey at Executive Title. Highly recommend her. And if you have a senior parent or you are a senior, have any questions, please get in touch with us, either Justin or myself, and we can put you in touch with Marguerite as well if you have more specific questions about title.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was very
fun
chatting with you, and I learned a great deal, and I hope that our listeners did as well.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.